One thing we should mention is that a lot of military from the United States that went over to Afghanistan had never been there before. And they would ask me or Steve or other people, other journalists, what's going on here? And I said, well, in order to understand Afghanistan, you have to understand Pakistan. In order to understand Pakistan, you have to understand India. It's all tied together in sort of the umbrella way that, yes, it may seem like low-lying fruit, but the intelligence agencies are full of ambitious officers. They have spent time in the military, yet there has not been, under the Taliban, really the new Afghanistan didn't inherit an intelligence agency, and I think you deal with Amrullah Saleh and some characters from the Kabul side that have been suspicious about Pakistan forever. And if they do blame somebody, they will blame Pakistan, and there's probably some truth behind it. How did you, when you were reporting from the Afghan side, how did their heart rate go up as their stories about Pakistan's subterfuge and complicity enter into how you reported?
Well, I mean, there's maybe two things. One is I did try to understand the history of the Afghan intelligence service. Some of that ended up on the cutting room floor because even I recognized that I was going nerd rogue with some of this material. But it's a very interesting story. Since we have an expert audience here, I'll give just a quick digest of it. You know, what was so interesting was that even with the Taliban, there was not that much discontinuity in the Afghan intelligence service. It started out as an instrument of the king to figure out what was going on in the provinces, and it all reported centralized into the palace. And it developed essentially as a mechanism of royal control. And then the Soviets came in, and it was remade in the image of the KGB, really hardcore. And then they would recruit across ethnicities, but they tended to recruit from the ethnicities closest to the Soviet border, so Tajik and Uzbek, and they'd send these guys to Moscow and KGB Academy and whatever kind of electroshock therapy it is that they teach in their interrogation methods. And a lot of these guys came back, and then they built very large, I mean huge, tens of thousands of employees in Khad. We remember Khad, the main thing that would cause everyone in Afghanistan to quake. You just didn't want to end up in a Khad interrogation cell.
That's K-H-A-D.
Yeah, and I mean, it sounds like something out of Mad Magazine, basically, but it was a horrifying institution, and it was made in the image of the KGB. So then the Soviets leave. Massoud comes in as Minister of Defense. Marshal Fahim Khan is the head of intelligence, and he basically keeps a lot of these ex-Khad guys who are in the right ethnic profile in place. Then they're forced to flee, the Taliban come in, but they leave behind, like it's such a deep bureaucracy, literally hundreds of thousands of people. It combines the role of the CIA and the FBI. And so the Northern Alliance, as we came to know them, they had this intelligence service completely wired because it was all their cousins. It was all the people they'd left in place when the Taliban came in. So when the Taliban fell, there was this kind of KGB-modeled, Khad-influenced, very Panjshiri-influenced organization that was already there. So that was the main instrument of it. Okay, there. That was on the cutting room floor. You have the outtakes, however boring.
Some of them did speak Russian, too. I mean, there was a legacy
Russian.
of that.
Yes, and you ask Amrullah Saleh, tell me about your biography, and there's like, there were the 3 years I was in Russia. So anyway, to answer your question about how the Afghan cabinet and security cabinet saw the Pakistan problem, I would say that in fairness to them, yes, it's an externalization of their own failures. Yes, it's a way of evading responsibility for corruption, failures of governance, factionalism, granted, stipulated. But, as a kind of beat reporter on the war, I felt like I understood Hamid Karzai reasonably well, interviewed him, saw him at press conferences. But when I went back and excavated the details of his interactions with the Americans over a long period of time and tried to recount his meetings with Americans at critical points, it was striking how consistent he was. Every time an American would sit down with him, he would say, what are you doing about Pakistan? What are you doing about ISI? do you not understand that our country is being destabilized by the infiltration and sanctuary that the Taliban are able to mount? And until you shut off that sanctuary, we are going to be on the receiving end of a very violent war.
They did kill his father.
They did kill his father, and there's another scene where the Americans are going in with 100,000 troops, and the war strategy, the American war strategy, is to put them in Helmand, which contains 3% of the Afghan population, and then put them in Kandahar, okay, maybe more justifiable, but still in the heartland of Afghanistan. And Karzai's view is, you should be putting 50,000 of those troops on the Afghan side of the Pakistan border and the other 50,000 on the Pakistan side of the Afghan border, and you should shut down this war. The Soviets came to the same conclusion, by the way, during the 1980s. They used Spetsnaz for that purpose. They thought they could get a hold of the infiltration routes. They never did. So he wasn't irrational about his view of ISI or of the Pakistani war. Yes, it was a form of evasion of responsibility, but it was also a very specific set of eyes on the war, and accurate in a lot of ways. And what happened, I think, to him, apart from other reasons why he became estranged from the United States, a significant one was that he took for granted that the United States was the world's most powerful superpower, and that if it wanted to stop ISI from supporting the Taliban and destabilizing Afghanistan, killing American troops, killing NATO troops, that it could. But it didn't. So there must be another explanation. Very South Asian way of thinking. And his explanation was that it was our intent to destabilize Afghanistan so we could justify a long-term troop presence there. And this really frustrated the Americans, this conspiracy theory, and they would come in and try to disabuse him of it. There's a scene where James Dobbins, a late special envoy to the war, goes to see Karzai in 2013. He says to him, Mr. President, by now you have all the Snowden materials. You have all the WikiLeaks cables. Can you see any trace of this design? And Karzai kind of half smiles and says, maybe you don't know the plan.